Hi, good afternoon. My name is Kim Livingston, and I am the membership coordinator for the Key West Art and Historical Society. I just wanted to take a moment to talk to those of you who attended last week's or registered for last week's Distinguished Speaker Series. We actually had some folks that were unable to get on due to our subscription with the host. We were only allowed to have 100 people attend these events. So we have since increased our membership, so we're able to take up to 200 people. So we should not have that issue again. And that talk will be posted on our website if you did happen to miss it. So of course, with an increased membership becomes increased cost. So if you're able to donate anything for these talks, we would greatly appreciate it. There'll be a donate button at the top of the screen throughout the talk. Any $5, anything you can afford, we would love it. We want to keep offering these talks for free, and that's part of the whole package. Also, to our members, I just want to let you know that while I don't have anything scheduled, any large member events that I usually do, by now you would have already probably attended a couple. I do have some membership breakfasts scheduled at the Custom House and the Lighthouse. That will be coming up shortly. At 5:25 today, you will get an email with the links to sign up for that. So if you do not get that email, please let me know. Since we're not able to see each other in person as frequently, I want to make sure that you're getting all the information that I am sending out to you. And so at this time, I'll turn it back over to Cassandra so you can enjoy our distinguished speaker for the evening. Thank you very much.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Cassandra. I'm the education specialist here at the Key West Art and Historical Society. And thank you for joining us today for Fred Borch's talk, Piracy in Key West, Commodore David Porter and the Mosquito Squadron. So Fred Borch is the Regimental Historian and Archivist for the Army Judge Advocate General Corps. He served 25 years as an Army lawyer before retiring from active duty in 2005. The following year, he returned to the Army as a civilian, and today is the only full-time military legal historian in the U.S. government. Fred has history degrees from Davidson College, the University of Virginia, law degrees from the University of North Carolina, University of Brussels, and the Judge Advocate General School, and his master's from the Naval War College. Welcome, Fred, and thank you for joining us today.
Okay, well, thank you, Cassandra, and welcome one and all to hear something about piracy and Key West. And you can see the subtitle is Commodore Porter and the Mosquito Squadron. Next slide, please. So here's the real question then, huh? How long was he with Mosquito Control? And how many mosquitoes did he actually kill? Now, I can't hear you laughing, but I know you think this is really funny, and that's why I put this slide in here. Look, let's get to the bottom line. He had nothing to do with mosquito control, and in fact, mosquitoes really were his enemy, but I don't think he killed that many. Next slide. So some of you may have heard the talk that I gave last month in December about Key West in the 19th century and Cuban revolutionaries. And so before I start talking about Commodore David Porter, I wanted to wind up a couple of loose ends about Cuba. So I think we all know, because we live here and because we know that Key West is only 90 miles from Havana, that at the micro level, we have very close geographic relations with Cuba, at least, and in the past, certainly in the 30s, 40s, 50s, lots of tourism going back and forth between Key West and Cuba. But let's talk a little bit about it at the macro level and Cuba as a state. Next slide. So what I have discovered in doing some more research here is that not only did we have a close relationship as a town, as Key West, but the United States actually wanted to buy Cuba and was pretty persistent. So you can see here that when James K. Polk was president, he offered $100 million to the Kingdom of Spain for Cuba. And then Franklin Pierce, who was president a few years later offered $130 million. And then James Buchanan, who was the president right before the Civil War, offered $130 million on several occasions. The Kingdom of Spain, though, was not interested in selling Cuba. But my point is that even on a state level, there's always been this intense interest in Cuba. Next slide. And so again, really not that unusual that we would offer to buy something. Remember the Louisiana Purchase, Tom Jefferson in 1803, which pretty much doubled the size of the United States. And some of you know that we purchased Alaska from the Russians. We bought the Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1917. And even a very, very, very recent president talked about buying Greenland. So it's really not unusual that we would want to buy another piece of property, and it's happened in the past. Next slide. But all this brings me to the point then of, in the Spanish-American War, which started in 1898 and was over very quickly, we in fact acquired Cuba. And for a time we occupied it, but then pretty much decided against annexation and talked about Cuban independence. I want to back up quickly and say one of the reasons that we were really interested in Cuba was back in the 19th century, before the Civil War. There was slavery in Cuba, a heavily agrarian economy based on slavery. And so it was very attractive to Southerners in the states in the South that had slaves and had a plantation economy. So that was one reason, the economic value of Cuba. But in any case, when we gave Cuba its independence in 1902, I put independence in quotation marks because Senator Platt in Congress in 1901 put an amendment in that said, well, Cuba has independence, but if there's ever a need for the United States to intervene in Cuban affairs to protect American lives or property or whatever, we can do that. And in fact, still the vestige of our occupation of Cuba is Guantanamo Bay, which we have leased in perpetuity from the Cubans. And as you know, we have a naval base there now, and terrorists, alleged terrorists, are being held there awaiting trial by military commissions. Next slide. So all I want to leave you with is that our relationship with Cuba is pretty complicated. Next slide. So now let's talk about Porter and piracy and Key West. And so this is how I want to go through my talk today. And again, if you've heard me talk before, please don't wait until the end to ask questions. If you want to ask a question now, use the chat feature or the question feature and simply ask your question as I'm talking, and it'll give me a chance to answer your question and interrupt my presentation, which I really like to do. So we're going to talk about the world, the U.S., Florida, a little bit about naval warfare. Look, I spent my whole career in the Army. So how much do I know about naval warfare? Well, believe it or not, more than you would think, but I'm not an expert. And some of you certainly, if you have service with one of the sea services, probably know more. Then we're going to talk about piracy in the Caribbean, Porter and the Mosquito Squadron, and a couple of conclusory remarks. Next slide. So if we go back to the 1820s, because Porter and the Mosquito Squadron are in Key West from 1823 to 1825, you need to think about the world as it existed back then. The big struggle between the superpowers, England and France, which includes our own American Revolution in the 1770s and 80s, is over with the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815. The world, Europe, is ruled by kings and queens. The great exception is us. Next slide. But before I talk about that, the disruptions in Europe, Spain, France, the war with England meant that although Spain and Portugal still have colonies in South America and Central America, independence is in the air. And there's this great desire in Argentina, in Venezuela, in Mexico to have independence from Spain. And they naturally look to the United States and see that, hey, if the Americans were able to throw off the yoke of British rule, perhaps we can do the same thing and have our independence here in South and Central America. Next slide. And then if we're talking about the United States, I ask all of you to remember that in the early 1820s, the United States is only 35 years old. That's not very old if you figure that 9/11, which for most of us seems like yesterday, happened 20 years ago. And is there an American identity? I think there is, as a historian. Next slide. I mean, we are the great experiment. This idea that men and women, but men do not need kings and queens and emperors and aristocrats to rule them, but then we can rule ourselves with a constitution and the rule of law. This is the great experiment, the only republic that's running in the world. And this idea that we're the New Jerusalem, the city on the hill. And this, of course, is the beginning of this idea of American exceptionalism, that we are exceptional as a people, as a country. And whether you believe it or not, this is really where it all begins. Next slide. Now, the other thing to remember is that the United States is not very old, it's young, but President James Monroe, our fifth president, announces in 1823 that the Western Hemisphere will not accept any more colonialism. Okay, we understand Spain and Portugal are here, obviously the British are here and some of the islands, but Monroe announces that it's now American policy that any attempts by Europeans or other powers to colonize in the Americas will be taken as an act of aggression. So all this is part and parcel with what's going on in the Caribbean and why I'm going to end up talking about the problem of pirates. Next slide. And then finally, the British are still the enemy. Remember that just a couple of years before, less than 10 years before, the British had landed, burned Washington, D.C., actually burned the White House. And so, believe it or not, there's this fear of invasion by sea for the next 100 years. It never happens, but because of the British invasion, that's why we have West Martella and East Martello, and why we have Fort Jefferson, because there's this belief that, and Fort Zachary Taylor, because there's this belief that we might have to repel an invasion from the sea. Next slide. And then, as you know, I always like to talk about what was it like to live here? How many states are there in the Union? Missouri is admitted as the, I think, 24th state in 1821. There are about 9.5 million people living in the United States. Compare that to today, where we have about 330 million. Median age, about 16. So think of this, half your country under the age of 16, pretty scary. Today, median age about 38. Life expectancy when porters in Key West, about 39, which means if you're born, your life expectancy is 39 years. Today, life expectancy 78, 79. What did people do? Well, most Americans are farmers, although obviously in the cities you have merchants and manufacturing. Not a lot. How much did people earn? A mason, a bricklayer, $1.50 a day. Now, if you're in the Navy, and we're going to talk about the Navy in a minute, an experienced sailor makes $20 a month. And a captain of a ship, a warship, makes $100 a month. So this is important if you talk about recruiting sailors. If I tell you that a sailor, a really competent sailor, is making $20 a month, that's considerably less than, say, someone who's a bricklayer making $1.50 or $2 a day. Next slide. And then the other thing to remember is that we don't really have much in the way of railroads, right? It's way too early. And the importance of this is then shipping and ships are really the key to commerce and getting around. And what are we talking about? Sails. Yes, steamships are on the horizon, but this is very much still the age of sail, the 1820s. Next slide. And then if we're getting down to the micro level, what about Florida? I think probably most Floridians should know that Florida was part of Spain until 1820. So when we talk about Porter and Key West and the Mosquito Squadron coming into Florida in 1823 to 1825, it only recently had become part of the United States. And it's not a state, it's still a territory. In fact, Andrew Jackson, the future president, is appointed as the governor in 1822. Next slide. So this is a really interesting point. The Spanish had ceded Florida to us in 1821, but when Perry sails into Key West in 1822 and claims it for the United States, there were only about 100 people living here, but no one was really sure that the Keys and Key West had really been ceded by Spain. In fact, the American government thought that it might be that the Keys and Key West were really North Havana. And so Perry's instructions are to sail into Key West and simply take possession of the islands and simply assume that they're ours. And if the Spanish don't like it, they'll let us know. Well, in fact, the Spanish never said anything about our taking possession of Key West. And so that's why it is part of Florida. But originally, it was very much an open question as to whether or not Key West had been part of the transfer. Next slide. So the Navy takes control in March of 1822 and renames Key West Thompson's Island. Now, I know you're all asking yourself, who was Thompson? And the answer is he was the Secretary of the Navy. So you can see even back in this period, naval officers are pretty smart. If I want to really brown nose the boss, I'll just name it after him. So it is called Thompson's Island. It hasn't been Thompson's Island for a long, long time, but that was originally what it was named. Next slide. So the problem in Key West, of course, water. We all know water was a problem before we had a pipeline that came down from the mainland. But the real problem has always been disease. Yellow fever, from mosquitoes, and that was the real problem on a cyclical basis. As the seasons change, you got to summer, you got to yellow fever. And that's a real problem for the Navy because there's no understanding of where yellow fever comes from, much less how to treat it. But nonetheless, Key West is so valuable and so geographically important if you're going to control the Caribbean and be able to have some sort of protection for your shipping that they stay in Key West. Next slide. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about naval warfare in the age of sail. Next slide. So if you're a sailor and you're talking about going to sea, you'd be out for 3 or 4 months without going into any port. And when you're underway, it's practice, practice, practice as a sailor. Now, when I say fire drills, I'm talking about how to handle a fire if it breaks out on a ship. Because as you might imagine, nothing is more frightening, nothing is more scary on a wooden ship than to have a fire break out. Because if the ship burns up, well, probably everyone is going down with the ship. And I think probably everyone recognizes that, although it seems rather strange, there were many sailors who didn't know how to swim, even though they're serving in the Navy. In fact, even today, we obviously have sailors in the Navy who are not very good swimmers. So fire drills. The other thing that they're practicing is hand-to-hand combat with cutlasses. That's a short sword that's really good for stabbing. And you're going to need that because you're talking about engaging in hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. And then long and short guns, pistols, rifles, and then Marines. This is the age when we put Marines up in the rigging of a ship and they act as snipers, trying to pick off the leadership, the officers on the enemy ships. Next slide. What's a sailor eating in these days? Hardtack. And then some of you probably know that it was a matter of law that every sailor got a half pint of distilled spirits every day. And at first this was rum, but rum was more expensive than whiskey, so the Navy tried to encourage its sailors to accept a half pint of whiskey every day. The occasional stew, and I put rats there. Yes, if you had rats on the ship and you could catch the rats, apparently the rat stew was tasty enough to eat. Officers had chicken, pork, and bread. And I read in one commentary that one captain ordered 100,000 oranges to be put in the hold of his ship when he got underway, because obviously citrus, scurvy, they recognized that you needed to have this to prevent scurvy. Next slide. And then it's all about wind. Now, in this particular age, if you don't have wind, if the winds are calm, well, then you're drifting. And this can be a real problem. There can be times when the winds are calm or there's not much for days on end. But sailors knew about the trade winds, the prevailing east to west winds, and we have those right here in Key West near the equator. And then there are also currents. They knew about the currents, the Gulf Stream, which obviously runs up the Atlantic over to Europe. But it's all about winds. Next slide. So the Navy only had 2 ships in 1798, the Constitution and the Constellation. And the Constitution is still in service. It's the #1 ship in the Navy, and it's up in Boston, right? Boston Harbor. Someone has said 8 ounces of liquor a day. They slept well. Well, it was a tough job. They probably did sleep well. Rum, whiskey? Yes. By the way, the Navy got rid of the ration of rum and whiskey right around World War I. The Secretary of the Navy, who I believe was a teetotaler, thought this was a bad idea. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about ships. Just to show you what's out there, you have frigates, which is a square rigged on all three masts. So when I said square rigging, it means it's square sail, and a square sail is going to give you the most powerful punch from the wind. It's going to be the fastest, and you can see here, then you have 300 men on the frigate, 1 to 2 decks. Corvettes, like frigates but fewer guns. Sloop of war, smaller still, and you can see the crews go down. The largest ship in the Navy at this time is a frigate. We don't have anything bigger. Next slide. And then their brigs, you can see 2 masts, square sails, they're smaller. Schooners, smaller still. Next slide. And then a gunboat and the barge. And the barges are really, really important in the in Porter's Mosquito Squadron, because the barges overcome the problem with not having any wind. You're able to row. Okay. Yes, a question about cutters. I do know they're revenue cutters. I'm sorry, I don't know when cutters are in the service. I don't believe at this particular time they're cutters in the Navy. Probably comes along a little bit later. Next slide. Okay, so just to give you an example then of a frigate, and Porter served on the Essex. It's 140 feet long. It has a 36-foot beam, which is its width. And you can see then 23 naval officers, 36 petty officers, 227 ordinary sailors, landsmen, boys, and then you have a small complement of Marines for a total of 319. Next slide. And here's a painting of the Essex. So you can see the 3 masts, the square sails. I mean, if you have a good steady wind, this ship will really move. Next slide. And the other thing that's important about Porter and the Mosquito Squadron is Porter actually ends up with a steamship. The first steamship in the Navy to see combat, the USS Seagull. Next slide. And here it is, a painting of the Seagull. So my understanding is that the Seagull was actually originally a steamship ferry purchased by the Navy, converted, but you can see that even the Seagull has masts and sails. Because what do you need to run a steamship? You need coal. And if you run out of coal, then you're going to need sail power to get you around. And by the way, as an aside here, this is one of the things that when steamships come into the Navy, when you begin to have steam-powered ships, you've got to have coaling stations. So Guantanamo Bay in Cuba becomes very, very important as a coaling station for naval ships to go in and pick up coal, because you got to have coal to run your steam-powered engines. Next slide. So how about communicating between ships? Well, you're not going to be able to yell. People aren't going to be able to hear you. So you're going to use semaphores. You're going to use flags. But the important thing here, folks, is that combat in the age of sail is all line of sight. You've got to be able to see the enemy. And how do you locate the enemy? Well, you take educated guesses. I mean, maybe you know that the enemy is in port in Havana, or maybe you know that the enemy is in port in over in Colombia or Venezuela. But pretty much you're out patrolling, trying to anticipate where the enemy might be. And then a lot of people think that the reason you're firing your cannons at an enemy ship is to sink it. And that wasn't the case. In fact, it's very, very difficult to sink a ship with cannons. So the question I hear is, where did Cuba get coal? Well, it has to be taken to Cuba. There are no coal mines on Cuba. So what you do is mine your coal in West Virginia or in Pennsylvania, and you take it down to Cuba where it would be stored. A lot of these coaling stations are islands, say out in the Pacific, where you're simply going to haul coal out there. That would be the case, for example, in Hawaii. Hawaii was a huge coaling station for the fleet, but you had to bring the coal out there and store it. So what you need to understand that in Porter's age, it's all about closing with the enemy, using grappling hooks to pull the enemy ship to you and then boarding it, and then you basically have a land fight on the deck of the ship. And the whole idea then is to capture the enemy ship and take it as a prize. So what you use your cannon for then is to fire into the masts, fire into the rigging of the ship, and demast the ship so that it's crippled and can't move. And then that's how you get in and you seize the ship. And all of you have heard about how the Navy took prizes, and then if it's an enemy ship, maybe it'll be bought by the Navy or taken by the Navy, but sailors will end up getting some sort of prize based on the value of the ship. Next slide. So if we're talking about cannon, a 24-pounder just means that the shot weighs 24 pounds, and you can see this. It has a range of 1,200 yards, which is about 3/4 of a mile, but you really are not going to fire from that range. You're going to try to get in as close as you can, and you might even engage at 25 to 50 yards, which obviously is very, very close. Next slide. They also had some smaller cannons called carronades. One thing that's interesting here is that you could have a cast iron cannon, but your problem with iron was it rusted. And I think we all know what salt air does to iron. So the really good cannons were made out of brass because brass does not rust the way iron does. Next slide. So the biggest problem that all navies have in this era, and Porter is no exception, is it takes years and years of training and experience to be able to sail a ship and to be able to sail a ship in combat. Lots and lots of experience with cannon, firing the cannon, moving the cannon, and then being able to do it under the stress of combat. And so recruiting is always a problem. And it's always been a problem unless you have some sort of a merchant navy or some sort of a fleet out there of commercial ships where they're sailors. So one of the reasons that the Royal Navy is so successful throughout history, much more successful than the French or the Spanish, is because the British at heart were a seafaring nation. And they always had really, really good sailors because there was so much commercial traffic being done by sea. But for Porter and for all American naval officers in this period, the real problem is recruiting. And again, if you remember, I said a couple of minutes ago that a sailor, a really good sailor, is only getting $20 a month. Hard to recruit, hard to retain people if that's all you're paying. Next slide. And then finally about the Navy, so one of the questions was, what about impressment? Yes, one of the causes of the War of 1812 is that the British were impressing Americans into the Royal Navy. And why were they doing impressment? Because the British were short sailors. It was also pretty typical in this particular period for a sailor maybe to jump ship from one ship to another. The British claimed, the Royal Navy claimed, that its sailors were jumping ship to serve on American vessels, commercial vessels where they would get more pay. That may or may not have been true. I think in some cases it was. But the question is, what about impressment? Yes, that's where you would come up to, say, a Royal Navy ship would come up to an American commercial ship and simply take its sailors and impress them into the Royal Navy service. Last thing I want to talk about is just ranks in this time. It's Commodore Porter, but Commodore is not really a rank. It was an honorary title. So in the Navy today we have ensigns, lieutenant junior grade, lieutenant, lieutenant commander, commander, captain, and then the admirals. But back in this particular period, there were only 4 ranks in the Navy. There is no admiral in the U.S. Navy until the Civil War. Next slide. Okay, and now finally piracy. Next slide. Recognize this guy? The guy on the right? Captain Phillips, Tom Hanks. If you haven't seen the movie, obviously you should, and you'll remember that the Somali pirate on the left is famous for saying to Tom Hanks, "I'm the captain now." Next slide. So why piracy? Well, there's a lack of law enforcement on the high seas because police forces generally are national institutions, also very hard to communicate. I mean, how do I really know where the pirates are and who they are when I can't really communicate? Next slide. And then the risks, at least some pirates think the risks are pretty low. If I can attack, capture, rob all the people on a ship, maybe I sink the ship, or maybe I kill the people on the ship and I get away with it, the risks maybe don't seem to be that high. But the penalties became increasingly severe, and after a while, the British simply hanged pirates. Next slide. So why do we have piracy and pirates in the Caribbean? So it's an interesting answer because there are pirates, but much of this problem that Porter faces when he's sent down by the Navy to Key West in 1823 all grows out of the conflict between Spain and its disappearing colonial empire. So the Argentines, the Venezuelans, the Mexicans are all in revolt against the Kingdom of Spain. And in dealing with its enemies, Spain doesn't have enough ships to be able to attack these enemy ships of its colonies in revolt. And so what the Spanish do is they say, look, we're going to commission private ships to do our business for us. And these are what are called privateers. So you could be a Cuban ship or a Puerto Rican ship, and you could say to the King of Spain, I would like a commission to be a privateer. And that means if you got that commission, then you lawfully were allowed to attack any shipping that was favoring the enemy. So, for example, let's say a British ship pulls into the port of Buenos Aires in Argentina. Argentina is in revolt against Spain. The British ship fills up with goods and it sails north to the United States, and it's attacked by a privateer off Puerto Rico. The ship is captured, taken into Puerto Rico and held because the British ship was doing trade with an enemy, Argentina. The ship now is seized, sold, and the privateer gets part of the proceeds. So American ships and British ships and other neutral ships not involved in this war between the Spanish and their colonies who are trying to break free are subject to being attacked by these privateers. And this is the big problem in the United States. President Monroe says we can't tolerate these attacks on American commercial shipping by these privateers. And by the way, there are also pirates out there, those who simply will prey on any kind of commercial shipping because they can get away with it. Next slide. So here, if you look at this map of the Caribbean, you can see Key West's location there is ideal for being in the Florida Straits and being able to have that as your base, because your pirates and your privateers are operating in the Straits and then going to Cuba or going to Puerto Rico, also going to Mexico. And you can see the proximity of all of them is such that a pirate could sail out of Cuba, could sail out of Mexico, could sail out of Puerto Rico, a pirate or a privateer, attack the vessel, and then quickly escape. Next slide. These are the pirate waters. Next slide. So how about David Porter? Born right in the middle of the Revolution, has a 28-year career as a naval officer, 10 children. He has a very famous son, David Dixon Porter, who's an admiral in the Civil War. And then he has a foster son, Farragut, who's also a very famous naval officer in the Civil War. But Porter has a very, very, very interesting career. Next slide. Here he is, a painting of him. Next slide. And an etching of Porter. Next slide. And how about the Mosquito Squadron? Why was it called the Mosquito Squadron? Next slide. Well, it's because most of the vessels were relatively small with a shallow draft. And in a minute, I'll explain to you why this is so important. Next slide. So it had nothing to do with mosquitoes. In fact, no one knew at the time that mosquitoes were responsible for yellow fever. But it was simply called the Mosquito Squadron because they were small vessels. Next slide. And this is their mission. Suppress piracy and suppress the slave trade. Because you'll remember from your history that the United States has outlawed the trade in slaves in 1808. But there's still a slave trade going on. Slaves are being still smuggled into the United States, and slavery is legal in Cuba. In fact, slavery is not outlawed in Cuba until I think 1886. So part of this is also to suppress the slave trade, because even though the trade is supposed to be ended, it's still going on. Just to give you some numbers, there are, I said, 9 million Americans and about 1.5 million enslaved people in the United States. So a fairly large population. Next slide. So February 1822, naval stores and materials arrive in Key West, and the Navy begins to construct a depot, a hospital, workshops, quarters. Next slide. This is a photograph, not a photograph, an etching of Key West in the 1830s. And you can see that not that many structures, but it certainly had increased a lot from the 100 who were living there just a couple of years before. Next slide. So March 1823, Porter reports to Congress when he gets to Key West that about 30 American ships are departing Havana every week, and another 20 from Natanzas, which is another port in Cuba. So that's really a lot of shipping, 50 ships. Next slide. But Porter's problems is that traditional ships, a frigate like the Essex, is too great a draft to follow pirates into the shallow bays and coves. So if you're talking about the Keys and you're a pirate in a small boat, a schooner or a sloop, you can get in and around the shallow waters of the Keys and escape from a big ship like a frigate. So this is Porter's first problem, is a ship like the Essex, on which he had previously served, isn't going to work in the shallow waters around here. And then the other problem is that the pirates will hit and run to Puerto Rico, run to Cuba, put into port, and the Spanish government refuses to allow David Porter to pursue them onto land. Why? Well, because obviously the Spanish are saying it's our sovereignty. We're not going to allow Americans to violate our sovereignty. But I think most historians believe that, yes, that's true. But it was also that the privateers, the pirates, were bringing a lot of money into the economy of Cuba and Puerto Rico. And so there was a very good reason to look the other way, as long as the pirates and the privateers were not preying on Cuban, Puerto Rican, or Spanish ships. If they're taking it out on Americans and British, hey, we can look the other way. But this is a real problem for Porter, because he needs to be able to pursue the pirates in order to catch them, and he needs to be able to pursue them onto Spanish territory. Next slide. So he has 16 ships, and we go quickly through these. These are the names. His flagship is the Peacock. Next slide. And then I want you to see the barges: the Mosquito, the Gnat, the Midge, the Sandfly, and the Gallinipper. The Gallinipper is a really big mosquito. But one of the geniuses of Porter's Mosquito Squadron is he overcomes the problem of not having wind, and he overcomes the problem of pursuing pirates into shallow waters by having these barges that are manned by men with oars. Next slide. And then the real innovation, and I think this is really important, is he gets this steamship. So if the wind is not blowing in the right direction, or the wind's not blowing at all, but I'm pursuing a pirate, I can use the Seagull to tow the barges in pursuit of the pirates. And then when we get close enough, I can loose the barges and they can go after the pirates. And that, in fact, is what Porter did on more than one occasion. Next slide. So he launches his operation in 1823. You can see he hits pirate bases in all these particular locations. Again, some problem with being able to pursue pirates onto Cuban or Puerto Rican territory, but very, very successful. Next slide. Next slide. And again, if we look at a map, you can see Puerto Rico there over to the right, and then obviously Cuba, Central America. So the Mosquito Squadron is patrolling all this particular area and pursuing pirates as they catch them. Next slide. So here's an actual engraving of a Florida pirate. This is a book out of the Library of Congress, and you can see the engraving of the pirate looks nothing like Johnny Depp, but you can see this. This is Manuel the pirate. So the question is, where in the Keys were the pirate bases? From what I understand, in the upper Keys. So up around Largo and then down around Isla Morada. Any place the pirates could get into a shallow area where they didn't think the Navy could find them. But the majority of pirate bases are not in the Keys, but are in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, and in Mexico. Next slide. So the big success for Porter, and this is the one that's most famous, is his pursuit and the destruction of the pirate Diabolito, or the Little Devil is his name, in April of 1823. Next slide. So what happens with Diabolito is that Porter pursues him, catches him, and fires on the ship. The ship is actually demasted. The pirates jump into the water. It's off the coast of Cuba. Most of them escape, but about 30 of them are drowned or killed. Diabolito later gets another ship, but is still pursued by Porter's squadron, cornered once again. And this time, Diabolito, when he jumps into the water, is recognized by the Americans pursuing him, and he's shot and killed. But the problem still is pursuing these pirates onto land. And again, as I said earlier, it's because the Spanish will not allow it. Next slide. But it all comes to a head in Puerto Rico at the port of Fajardo. Next slide. So you can again see where Puerto Rico is, a long way from Key West. Next slide. And in October of 1824, a Lieutenant Platt, who is one of Porter's men, pursues pirates into Fajardo, and the Spanish arrest Platt. Next slide. Porter is so incensed at this Spanish arrest of one of his officers that he lands at Fajardo with 200 men and demands an apology from the Spanish authorities, which the Spanish authorities quickly give. They say, "We're very sorry, Commodore Porter. Of course, this was a misunderstanding. We never meant to hurt or harm the honor of Lieutenant Platt, but all is not well," because the Spanish file a formal complaint claiming that Porter has violated their sovereignty, which was true. Next slide. Well, Porter actually had instructions that permitted him to land, but only on unsettled portions when pursuing pirates. The problem was that the pirates were rarely being pursued into unsettled portions, and certainly Fajardo as a port was not unsettled. Next slide. And so the result is that Porter is court-martialed. He's found guilty, and he's sentenced, although he keeps all his pay and allowance, to be suspended for the Navy for 6 months. Well, this is such a blow to Porter. He's so upset that he should be court-martialed for simply trying to reduce piracy. Next slide. That he resigns his commission and joins the Mexican Navy. In fact, he becomes the commander of the Mexican Navy. Now, let's be honest, the Mexican Navy was not real good at the time because Mexico had only gotten its independence, or was still getting its independence, 1820, 1821. But nonetheless, he serves as the commander-in-chief of the Mexican Navy for 3 years, but then, deciding that's not for him, he manages to get an appointment as the charge d'affaires for the Ottoman Empire in what today is Istanbul, Turkey, and he's there for 13 years, where he dies in 1843. And so ends Porter's career. Next slide. So what's really important here is that at the height of this anti-piracy campaign, Key West is the busiest naval base in the United States. Next slide. And because of Porter's work as the head of the Mosquito Squadron, piracy virtually ceases in American and Caribbean waters by 1825. Next slide. 80 pirate ships captured, 1,300 pirates, a significant blow to pirates and privateers. Next slide. But as usual, you could be too good, well, at least from Key West's perspective, because the Navy moves to Pensacola. Next slide. And once again, we experience the impact of downsizing here. So next slide. Before I talk about this, let me see were the captured pirates killed? You know, that's an interesting, very interesting question. Under British law, there was no requirement for any trial. If you caught the pirate, you simply hanged the pirate. My understanding is that pirates caught by the Americans, some were turned over to the Cuban authorities, and I believe that some were tried here in the U.S., but were they simply killed? The British hanged them. Certainly if they committed murder or whatever, then they would probably get the death sentence. But I don't know what happened in the States with the pirates that we captured. Okay, coal needs water too, brought into dry islands. Yes, absolutely. Any information about the USS Alligator? I'm sorry, I don't have anything, but I bet Mr. Google does. Are there records on any of these key bases, the pirate bases? Not that I know of. At least I didn't see any in my research. So as for piracy today, some of you probably read occasionally how they're pirates. We've all seen the Captain Phillips movie, Piracy off the coast of Somalia. But there's a lot of problems with pirates off the coast of Indonesia, the Malacca Straits, a lot of problems in the South China Sea. Every so often you'll read an article about how a tanker, an oil tanker has disappeared, or a big cargo ship has disappeared, and the belief is it's been kidnapped or been seized by pirates, taken into Vietnam, cut up, or reflagged or whatever. And then I read recently that even on the Danube River, they're having a problem with pirates along Serbia and Romania. So, any questions, any comments? Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm certainly happy to answer any other questions, but otherwise, thanks for listening. Hope you learned something.
All right, thank you again to everybody who's joined us today. So we do have another DSS talk on February 4th. Sharika Crawford is going to be talking about turtling in the Caribbean. So go ahead to our website and register for that talk as well. We'll see you all then. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.